For this video, we're going to look at Amendments 16 through 19. These amendments are often referred to as the Progressive Era Amendments because they came out during, you guessed it, the Progressive Era. This was a time period in our history roughly from the 1890s through the 1920s. And they had a lot of goals, the members of the Progressive Movement. They were trying to solve these problems that had come up because of rapid industrialization. Our cities were growing, urbanization was going on where large numbers of immigrants were coming into the country. There were more and more jobs in factories, in cities, and these created a lot of problems for children working in terrible conditions in factories, people living in terrible conditions packed into like apartment buildings that were unhealthy and unsafe. This is also a time period where there was a wide gap between the wealthy and the poor, and there was a lot of corruption in politics. So they had a lot they wanted to do, and they did achieve a lot during the Progressive Movement, during the Progressive Era. And part of the way that they achieved that goal was to try to get some reforms at the national level through constitutional amendments. And during this period is really, there's a lot of big changes that occurred because of these amendments. So let's look at them one at a time. The 16th Amendment, yay, taxes! This was the amendment that allowed Congress to establish an income tax. Why would the Progressive Movement push for this? Well, at the time, like we were talking about, a wide gap between the wealthy and the poor. The income tax initially was only really affected the super wealthy and collected a small amount of their income, and then that money could then be used for social programs, other things to help the rest of the citizenry. That has, of course, expanded over time to where a lot of people pay income tax now, but it is a progressive tax system, meaning that the more money you make at higher levels of income, you're going to pay a higher percentage of that higher level of income. But the less you make, the lower percentage that you would pay. For the 17th Amendment, we're looking at, yay, politicians. The 17th Amendment changed the Constitution so that citizens get to directly elect their U.S. senators. Before the 17th Amendment, U.S. senators were picked by state legislatures. So that meant that if you had some corrupt politicians at the state level of government, they got to control who took part in the U.S. Senate. And people saw this as undemocratic and meant that the Senate did not really listen to the will of the people, and so the Progressive Movement wanted to change that. So ever since the 17th Amendment, the whole state will vote for the two senators that represent that state. This proposal actually took almost 100 years to happen. The first time this was proposed as an amendment was back in 1826. You see this young lad walking into Congress, the idea of electing senators by direct vote. Many times it would pass the House of Representatives, but funny, it seemed to have trouble passing in the U.S. Senate. I wonder why U.S. senators didn't want to have to run for election all the time. So it took a long time for that to eventually change. So it took through the Progressive Movement to get more politicians elected in the House to keep supporting this, and also to put pressure on state legislatures and the U.S. Senate to try to allow for those direct elections. So eventually that passed and went to the states. You can see that little sign there over on this side, meaning that that amendment would have to go out to the states to be ratified, and eventually it was, and that became the 17th Amendment. The 18th Amendment, yay, organized crime. I'm kidding. But the 18th Amendment was the amendment that often called the Prohibition Amendment, which banned the sale and production of alcohol. So this was a big change in U.S. society. There was a big push during the Progressive Movement, especially women who wanted to ban alcohol and try to get rid of alcohol because really the United States had a big problem with alcohol at the time. It was causing a lot of trouble with people losing work, domestic violence, led to a lot of early deaths because of alcoholism. So that was the push to try to outlaw the sale and consumption of alcohol, but it caused a lot of problems because it was hard to enforce A lot of people did not like this idea of prohibition, and it did lead to the rise of organized crime in the United States because criminal organizations realized they could make a lot of money by selling illegal alcohol. So there were a lot of bad consequences to the 18th Amendment. You'll have to stick around for another video of ours to find out what happened to the 18th Amendment because, of course, today the sale and production and consumption of alcohol is not outlawed, so something had to change there. But the 18th Amendment was the Prohibition Amendment, outlawed alcohol. Our final progressive era amendment that we're going to look at is the 19th Amendment. This is the big one. Yay, voting! This amendment gave women the right to vote. It said that you could not discriminate based on gender when making laws about voting. So this gave a lot of women the right to vote. Note at the time this passed, though, it mostly affected white women because there were still a lot of things in place to try to keep minority women from voting and minority men from voting. But this was a big, big step in increasing the amount of people who could vote and had a major impact on our democracy because it instantly creates this larger pool of voters. And so the progressive pushed for this because a lot of women were key leaders in the progressive movement and knew that they would need more political influence if they were really going to push the progressive movement forward. So these are the progressive era amendments, and hopefully this helps you review and reminds you of what these are. Thank you for watching, and if you have any questions, contact your government teacher.